Hi, this is the AI Storyteller. I'm Mark. The short story collection I'm interpreting for you in this issue is called The Lives of Girls and Women, written by Alice Munro, a Canadian author and Nobel Prize laureate. In 2013, Munro was awarded the Nobel Prize, which caused a significant stir in the literary world. By that time, Munro's literary standing had long been recognized, as she had received numerous honors such as the International Booker Prize and the National Book Critics Circle Award. People were surprised by her win because most Nobel laureates are known for their extensive and rich body of work, with large-scale and numerous literary achievements. Throughout her life, Munro focused solely on the genre of short stories, and her literary accomplishments were primarily attributed to this form, earning her the title of the Chekhov of the female world. This aspect is usually considered a disadvantage in the competition for the Nobel Prize in Literature. Before her, no writer who exclusively wrote short stories had ever won the Nobel Prize. Therefore, Munro's achievement of winning the most influential literary award in the world can be considered a milestone event for the development of the short story genre itself. The Swedish Academy, in its award citation, not only praised Munro as a contemporary master of the short story but also stated that many Nobel laureates in the sciences dedicate themselves to solving great mysteries concerning the universe and our objective reality, while very few people, like Munro, have unraveled the greatest mystery of all, the human heart and its capriciousness. The Lives of Girls and Women, which I will be interpreting for you today, is one of Munro's representative works and is highly representative in terms of its themes and style. The subjects depicted in this novel align closely with Munro's own experiences and possess strong autobiographical elements. The form employed by Munro in her work also provides a clearer structure for these short stories, allowing for more complete development of the characters and their narratives. Through this book, we can gain a more intuitive understanding of both the author, Munro, and her works. Part 1. Let's first gain a brief understanding of Munro's life and the structure of the lives of girls and women. Munro was born in 1931 in a small town in Ontario, Canada. Her father worked as a farmer, initially raising foxes and minks for a living before switching to turkey farming. Her mother was an ordinary teacher. Munro wrote her first short story when she was in her teens, but after enrolling in university to study English and journalism, she actually took a break from writing. She juggled reading, working part-time, and being deeply involved in a romantic relationship, ultimately dropping out of university in her second year to marry James Munro. They had 4 daughters together, but their second daughter died shortly after birth. The majority of Munro's early life was spent balancing her position within the mundane and trivial aspects of everyday life. She managed household chores and co-owned the Munro's Books bookstore with her husband, which is still in operation today. It wasn't until 1968, at the age of 37, that Munro rediscovered her passion from her teenage years and published her first collection of short stories, titled Dance of the Happy Shades. It received widespread attention and marked the beginning of her second phase of life. In 1972, Munro's literary career began to flourish, while her personal life underwent a major turning point. She divorced James Munro and married her second husband, Gerald Fremlin, whom she had met during her university years. Fremlin, a scholar and a devoted reader of Munro's work, agreed to let her retain the surname Munro that she had acquired from her first husband. Her second marriage was happy and enduring. Munro moved her family back to her hometown in Ontario from near Vancouver, and this living arrangement has continued to the present day. The greatest regret of Munro's later years was perhaps the passing of her husband, Fremlin, in April 2013, just months before the Swedish Academy awarded her the Nobel Prize. As we mentioned earlier, almost all of Munro's literary achievements throughout her life were in the field of short stories. Today's book, The Lives of Girls and Women, published in 1971, embodies the characteristics of short stories while also deviating slightly from the norm. In terms of form, this book presents itself as a standard collection of short stories, featuring a total of 8 stories, with one of them, The Lives of Girls and Women, serving as the title for the entire book. However, unlike most collections of short stories, all of the pieces in this work are narrated in the first person by the same character, Dell. The names, identities, and environments of other characters also remain consistent, as they all reside in a small town called Jubilee in Ontario, Canada. Each of these short stories has its own independent plot while maintaining a certain continuity between them. Additionally, all the stories are arranged in chronological order based on when the events take place. For these reasons, some critics consider this book to be Munro's only novel. However, the prevailing consensus in the literary world now is to classify such works, loosely connected and both separable and combinable, as a story sequence. Another more descriptive term is a short story cycle. The stories we encounter in the lives of girls and women resemble those often encountered in life, usually uncertain and incomplete. Sometimes we are given the outcome without knowing the reasons behind it, while at other times, we see only fragments without a clear beginning or end. Munro frequently employs metaphors and subtle techniques to imply the themes and characteristics of her characters. However, she never directly intervenes in the narrative or emerges from the text to pass moral judgments. In other words, when reading Munro's stories, we need to imagine the origins and developments of the narrative based on various explicit and implicit details, without a definitive answer. This is actually a typical technique found in contemporary short stories, and Munro is one of the most adept practitioners of this style. Part 2. Now let's delve into this collection and explore the people and events that unfold in the town of Jubilee. The novel is set in the 1940s and 1950s, aligning closely with Munro's own adolescence. The protagonist, Dell, is an intelligent and sensitive high school girl who finds herself at a crucial stage of personal development. She loves reading, enjoys observing her surroundings, and possesses a vivid imagination that questions the closed-off and conservative atmosphere of the small town. At the same time, Dell is experiencing the awakening of her sexuality and has a strong gender consciousness. She both sympathizes with and resists the experiences of the women around her, and she feels both curiosity and fear toward the men who appear in her life. She engages in half-truth, half-fiction conversations about sex with her girlfriends. Each story in the novel revolves around a central character, some of whom are Dell's relatives, while others are individuals she knows. However, the entire novel is narrated solely from Dell's perspective. The material presented is either witnessed by her firsthand or obtained through hearsay, and she reconstructs and analyzes the stories to form the complete narratives. These stories not only showcase the customs and portray the experiences and personalities of these storied characters within the small town, but they also serve as a mirror reflecting Dell's personal exploration. This exploration involves her external questioning and criticism of the outside world and an internal focus on her physiological and psychological changes, particularly her budding sexual awareness. The 8 stories narrated by Dell may appear loosely connected, but they carry a sense of underlying coherence in terms of their themes. We can approach them from 3 angles to find the common threads. We will also discover that these threads run consistently throughout this work and often appear in Munro's other stories. The first angle revolves around the intense conflict between the individual and the social environment. The Lives of Girls and Women is set in the 1940s and 1950s, a time of significant global changes, including in North America. The 2 world wars, the economic roller coaster from prosperity to depression and back to prosperity, and the profound transformations in people's way of life were prominent features of this era. The post-war labor shortage provided an opportunity for the development of feminism. In the 1940s and 1950s, Canada experienced many milestones in feminist history, such as women in Quebec gaining the right to vote and the formation of female militias during World War II. As these historical phenomena gradually infiltrate the town of Jubilee, the closed-off environment of the town clashes with the increasingly influential trend of globalization in metropolitan areas. The new faces, roles, and self-awareness of women are seen as harmful, dangerous, and deviant by the conservative residents of the small town. Those caught between the larger context and the constraints of the small town, especially women, live under the constant pressure of external questioning and self-doubt. The Lives of Girls and Women depicts several women who are viewed as outsiders by the townspeople, with the most notable being Miss Veringer, the music teacher and unmarried woman in the story Changes and Ceremonies. She always dresses inappropriately for the times and is immersed in her own world, with all her passion channeled into music. The townspeople say she just wants to catch a man, but Fern, a female tenant in Dell's household, realizes that Miss Veringer's pursuit may not necessarily involve a man. Dell soon discovers that the sunrise glow, untinged with rouge radiating from Miss Veringer's face, has nothing to do with the rumored object of her unrequited love, but rather stems from her own happiness. Munro's writing stops short of revealing Miss Veringer's true and specific inner world. We can only sense that she is forever out of sync with her environment. She refuses to conform to traditional norms, and her behavior and speech do not align with the typical expectations placed on women. We can infer that she inevitably faces pressure from the social environment as a result. At the end of this story, Miss Veringer suddenly jumps into the river and commits suicide, remaining undiscovered for 6 days and 6 nights. No one can tell Dell the reason behind this act. She can only rely on her own reflections and reach the conclusion: I felt she belonged to an older time, to the most innocent and primitive emotions and some wrong ideas. I felt she was trapped in that time, and I was amazed that she had broken free by this act, if it could be called an act. Miss Veringer defies the pressure exerted by society by resorting to death. The fate of this character profoundly and shockingly impacts Delaware. The second angle is the complex and subtle dynamics of gender relations, or gender politics. The male characters that appear in this book, though few in number, leave a lasting impression. For instance, in the first story, The Flats Road, the first character introduced is Uncle Benny, who orders a single mother, Madeline, through a classified advertisement in the newspaper, seeking to solve his lifelong issue through this crude and straightforward approach. However, Madeline is a mysterious and enigmatic woman, and her eccentric and unpredictable behavior is puzzling. In the end, she leaves with her child without a word. Only when asked or joked about does Uncle Benny seem to recall her with no regrets or remorse, tinged with a hint of contempt. Like in other stories, no moral judgments are made, and the author does not reveal whether the marriage was a deception. One thing is certain, though: the lack of effective communication between husband and wife in this marriage. Placed at the beginning of the lives of girls and women, this story is almost a microcosm of the town's gender dynamics. In the second short story, Princess Ida, Uncle Craig, a civil servant in the town, spends his spare time passionately writing a local history and compiling a family genealogy. As a male member of the household, he enjoys pontificating about politics, history, and elections. He believes that it is only natural for women to take care of household chores, and the women in the family fully endorse him, considering him the pride of the entire clan. In Munro's portrayal, the division of labor between men and women in the town is stark, with women constantly occupied with a multitude of domestic tasks. Uncle Craig's devotion to writing history strikes a chord with Dell, and in the end, she also decides to immerse herself in writing, a decision that can be seen as a rebellion against the fate assigned to women in the small town. At the end of this story, Uncle Craig passes away due to a heart attack after completing over 1,000 pages of manuscript. His work does not succeed, and it is Dell, the woman who should have been trapped in domestic duties, who ultimately realizes his dream. Such an arrangement constitutes a meaningful irony challenging the stereotypes of gender politics. Furthermore, we can also view these stories from the perspective of ecological and environmental ethics. The Lives of Girls and Women possesses a strong regional character, with Munro devoting a considerable portion of the novel to depicting the interpersonal relationships and ecological environment of a small town in southwestern Canada, particularly the relationship between humans and animals. Like Dell's father and Munro's own father, they both made a living through fox fur trapping, and Uncle Benny frequently hunts and traps muskrats. Dell is highly sensitive to the harshness of the food chain and shows deep sympathy for animals subjected to cruelty. In her eyes, animals are not inferior beings. Whether it's a frog on the road, a cow, or their own dog, they all have personalities and dignity. This strong environmental awareness permeates the novel. The most notable example occurs in the fourth story, The Age of Faith. In this story, Dell's family sheepdog, Major, who is old, mentally deteriorating, and partially blind, kills a sheep and is tragically shot by her father. Dell is deeply angered by this. She realizes that the reason adults so naturally and firmly put Major to death is not out of sympathy or compassion for the sheep but to prevent further economic loss, not because it was inevitable, but because people wanted it that way. The passage depicting her father shooting Major is deeply moving. Her father calmly loads the gun, calling Major's name, and the loyal old dog, accustomed to seeing people with guns, shows no signs of alertness. The culmination of this story is Dell's midnight dream of finding corpses hanging in her father's storeroom. But upon closer inspection, they are not animal corpses but skinned and dismembered human bodies. This sentence is sharp and poignant. Munro wants to convey that when humanity loses compassion for animals and fails to coexist harmoniously with the environment, it will face a backlash, and ultimately, humans themselves will suffer. Part 3. When reading the lives of girls and women, we can examine its themes from the three perspectives mentioned above. However, in the act of reading a novel, sometimes how it is written is more important than what is written. Next, let's use the titular story of this collection, The Lives of Girls and Women, as an example to see how Munro employs narrative techniques. This short story is placed in the latter half of the collection. Dell is in the throes of adolescence, with the scent of hormones permeating the texture of the entire story. However, her burgeoning sexual awareness lacks appropriate guidance, forcing her to navigate the complex environment and various dangers on her own. The male protagonist of this story, Boyce, encounters Dell by chance. He is the boyfriend of their house tenant, Fern. Boyce has fair hands and a plethora of stories from the battlefields of World War II. In the first scene of the story, he stands in the living room downstairs. Dell and this seemingly mature and witty man are separated by her mother. While Dell's mother casually chats with Boyce about precocious girls in tropical regions, she is alert and dismisses Dell to go upstairs. In this story titled The Lives of Girls and Women, Dell is always consciously or subconsciously distanced from the women. She believes that her life goal is to break free from the mold of the women, and she believes her life will be completely different from theirs. In Dell's eyes, even her mother is just one of those women. She keenly senses that her mother's feminist discourse is often empty, dogmatic, and lacking in strategy. When her mother passionately declares to Dell, "The lives of girls and women are changing, we have to make those changes for ourselves," Dell thinks to herself, "That's as far as she knows me." When talking with Dale's mother, Chamberlain said those girls in the tropical regions are not much older than Dale. This tempting voice echoed in Dale's ears. How did this voice make Dale feel? In Dale's first-person account, Munro described it as, "It was like artificial silk caressing my skin, enveloping me, making her feel danger and desire." At that moment, Dale was wearing her mother's black artificial silk nightgown adorned with pink and white flowers. After hearing Chamberlain's conversation with her mother, Dale didn't go to the dining room for dinner. Instead, she ran upstairs and took off her own clothes, putting on her mother's nightgown, fantasizing about what might happen between a man and a young girl. It was a subconscious act. We can understand it as, after being teased, Dale needed to suppress her bodily impulses. We can also further speculate that, when feeling danger and desire, the young girl Dale believed that the only way to feel safe was to encase her own body in the shell of women, even if it was artificial and cheap, even if it only provided certain illusions. Girls and Women was written by Munro in the late 1960s. At that time, as a young writer, she was adept at using sharp imagery in the details. Over 30 years later, in another short story, Wenloching, Munro arranged for a college girl to enter a millionaire's mansion, where the girl, under the millionaire's command, sat naked on a chair and recited the poem The Youth of West Parleton. The fur covering the chair played the same role as the artificial silk nightgown. Both stimulated the girl's desires but also made her feel that these desires were deliberately guided, entering a mode that she originally wanted to break free from. The girl in Wenloching was older, studying philosophy and English at university, and in the following years, she immersed herself in the library, writing papers and earning countless A's. However, she knew that none of it mattered because the fur on that chair was still pricking her. She said that even though the millionaire hadn't touched her, in the end, he did something to me. What exactly did he do? When we read Girls and Women alongside Wenloching, we can discern more meanings. Dale also always thought that Chamberlain would do something to her. The sexual encounter she anticipated was contradictory and chaotic, seemingly a romanticized male power combined with a hint of abstract female self-awareness. In her own words, she expected men to abandon the father or comrade-like friendliness and instead invade like lightning, a dreamlike, ruthless arrogance towards the respectable surface world. Whether it is herself or the chaotic world that has been invaded, Dale cannot say for sure. And readers' doubts are suspended by Munro's narrative time and time again. We all know that something is about to happen. We worry that the rebellion of a young girl might be exploited by worldly men. So, immediately after Chamberlain arrives in his car, honks at Dale, and makes her legs go weak, our hearts skip a beat. However, Munro's stories rarely follow a predictable path. The sexual assault we fear, along with even more dreadful events, never materialize. Munro excels at defying readers' expectations, and then catching them off guard with a different kind of shock. Gradually, we discover that the reason Chamberlain has come to pick up Dale is actually twofold. Firstly, he wants Dale to steal his girlfriend, Fern's letter, because he had made a promise to marry her in that letter. But now he wants to break that promise and escape. Secondly, he takes Dale to a secluded riverside, revealing a pathological exhibitionism, where he engages in a bizarre and incomprehensible personal performance for Dale to witness. Munro writes this segment with great patience, examining this man from Dale's perspective, showcasing his arrogance and weakness, describing him as the performance, which seemed forced, strangely and predictably exaggerated, like Indian dancing, amid the quiet envelopment of flower stems. Munro pushes the irony to its highest level, keeping that tension taut until the very end when one line of dialogue from Chamberlain turns everything into a dark joke. "You're in luck, aren't you?" He laughed at me, though he hadn't quite caught his breath. "You're in luck," the millionaire in Wenloching probably thought the same way. In their definition, this self-indulgent display of gender superiority by men has not caused any visible harm to women, demonstrating their moral restraint. What reason does a woman have to demand more? In Munro's stern portrayal, the chasm between these two worlds is thought-provoking. There is also a side note in the story, describing Dale seeing a white peacock hiding in a tree by the roadside, hearing in its cries madness, scolding, and chaos. However, when she recounts this incident to Chamberlain, his immediate response is to start singing a song, with the lyrics being "Go see the peacock, go see the beautiful peacock." Dale's friend quickly joins in praising the peacock's beauty, which irritates Dale. As she goes upstairs to sleep, Dale writes a line of poetry, "In the hazy night, what is crying in the trees? Is it the song of the peacock, or the ghost of winter? What does the peacock represent? What does beauty represent? And what does Dale's aversion represent?" We don't really need to delve into specifics, because by the time Munro's short stories developed, both the author and the readers had become accustomed to not seeking definitive answers within the text. What we need to perceive is how barren the world of Girls and Women becomes when both women and peacocks are reduced to mere beauty. Likewise, in such a world, men ultimately devolve into rough symbols. Therefore, Dale cannot imagine Mr. Chamberlain clearly. She says, "His presence is important but always fuzzy. In the corners of my daydreams, he has no features, but he is powerful," and then he hisses away like a blue fluorescent light. At the end of Girl and Women, Chamberlain indeed disappears. Fern, his disillusioned girlfriend, sighs with sorrow, and Dale's mother, in front of Fern, says it's fortunate that she escaped a terrible marriage but privately expresses her pity for Fern's life. We cannot determine the extent of the damage to Fern's inner world, but the only certainty is that Dale's mind matures a little through the baptism of this story, and she has decided to resist the uncertainties. The progression of the plot and the destinies of the characters throughout the entire collection are always intertwined with Dale's personal growth. Her beliefs, understanding of things, and comprehension of life vary in each short story, and there may even be certain contradictions. By arranging these psychological processes in chronological order, readers can clearly see Dale's footsteps from youthfulness and naivety to gradual maturity and increasing determination. She transforms from a bystander and witness of these stories into a knowledge-seeking woman with initial independent awareness, and her ability and desire to engage with the stories grows stronger. In the final chapter, Epilogue, The Photographer, Dale proclaims her determination for her future career as a writer. She says, "The only way I can make life worthwhile is to write stories." At this point, Dale seems to step out of the stories, deciding to take control of life and narrative, transforming further from a participant in the stories to a narrator and creator of stories. In Munro's decades of creative work, many similar elements persist: women's lost sense of self, their submission to mental control, the underlying deep-rooted issues, and the individual's reflection and struggle against them. Munro tirelessly repeats and flexibly cultivates this small plot of land. In her early stories, she may have shown some hesitation when dealing with characters and uncovering wounds, but when it came to expressing her stance, the early Munro never shied away and never concealed her fighter's demeanor. As time went on, the situation reversed. The characters and plots in her later works became more brutal, leaving no room for escape. However, Munro's own attitude became softer. Her compassion and understanding of the women and their environments depicted in her writing became more abundant and subtle. In conclusion, we have analyzed the essence of the lives of girls and women here. We have gained a general understanding of Munro's technical characteristics as a writer. If we were to summarize it in one sentence, it would be: Munro's stories do not rely on dramatic plots or unexpected twists like O. Henry's stories. The surface of her stories may appear calm, but underneath, hidden currents flow. Munro skillfully allows her characters and readers to have epiphanies through certain seemingly casual details. This is a demanding technique that combines prose-like writing with precise design. At the same time, it requires a high level of attention from readers, as symbols and metaphors are subtly scattered throughout the text, easily overlooked if one isn't careful. It would be unfair to solely label the lives of girls and women as autobiographical fiction. Although much of the content in the novel draws from real life, exceptional writers like Alice Munro have the ability to make familiar things feel unfamiliar, to reveal textures beyond the surface of daily life. There are many girls and women who witness the scenery of small towns, but Munro is unique. In her writing, everyday things like man-made silk or a white peacock appear in their rightful places and acquire new narrative significance. It is not an exaggeration to say that Munro's writing style sets an example in the field of creative writing of her time and even today. It has not become outdated but remains a charismatic benchmark for short story writing across the centuries. Well, that concludes the content for this episode. If you enjoyed my video, please click like, subscribe to my channel, and share it with your friends. Thank you.